Yeah, hello everybody, my name is Wolfgang Kaleck and I'm the Secretary General of the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, ECCHR, based in Berlin, a litigation organization which tries to enforce human rights through legal means. And for us, that means that we use strategic transnational human rights litigation in a number of cases worldwide. We act especially in the nearly traditional field of international criminal law, in the field of business and human rights, and since a couple of years also in the field of migration. Transnational litigation is something different than civil liberties and human rights litigation in the national context, such as Philippines or elsewhere. Obviously, litigation organizations in the Philippines, in India or in Latin America face a number of problems we are not confronting here in Berlin. And that is above all the problem of violence against human rights defenders and shrinking spaces. We are a little bit safer in Berlin, in Western Europe, and obviously we have a lot more access to resources than you have. Therefore, it's very important that in order to carry out a meaningful human rights litigation, it's very important to cooperate on one hand between Western-based human rights organizations such as ours, organizations which are litigating in the countries, for example, Center Law in the Philippines or Human Rights Law Network, HRLN in India, and the affected communities. That is not easy because that requires a lot of resources, and that is of course challenging because in the affected states, such as India or the Philippines, there are a lot of obstacles, as well as in our countries. From my point of view, one of the most important dates in the history of human rights litigation is October 16th of 1998, the arrest of the former Chilean dictator Augusto Pinochet in London. Not because the arrest was a result of strategic litigation already. No, it wasn't. It was rather arbitrary when a Spanish prosecutor first started to file a complaint under Spanish jurisdiction, universal jurisdiction laws in Spain. And then later Chilean activists and lawyers joined his efforts. And that resulted also because of the courage of an investigation judge, Baltasar Garzón in Spain, and also the efforts of the British legal system in the arrest. But the interesting thing was more what the impact of this arrest warrant. It was a kind of call for action, call for legal action for all of us. It showed us that we can write legal history as well as the states normally would do, and the states normally would keep the monopoly for this kind of legal action. So what we had been observing since then is a growing involvement of civil society actors and social movements in that kind of litigation. In the first place, obviously in international criminal law. We can say that some efforts, some successes had been made, just to name some of them, which are not so well known. Human Rights Watch, especially their lawyer Reed Brody, cooperated through the last 20 years with actors from Chad, namely Jacqueline Modena, a lawyer from Chad, to pursue Hissène Habré, the former dictator from Chad, the so-called Pinochet from Africa, who had killed and tortured as many people as Pinochet himself. And they successfully achieved that Habre was put on trial in Africa, in Dakar, in a special tribunal of the African Union, and was finally convicted, which is a major success, and which shows us also, and that is remarkably negative, that these kind of successes are not really reported in the Western, in the European and North American world, but which are equally important as Pinochet's arrest himself. And the interesting thing is also that with a certain legitimation, post-colonial critiques of the Western human rights organization always criticized these organizations for only caring for individual political and civil rights, and not at all considering collective economic and social rights. That was expressed especially by the group TWAIL, Third World Approaches Towards International Law. Makao Mutwa and Anthony Angie are some of the most outstanding speakers of that group, and they rightly criticized Western groups for not really, for only focusing on non-Western perpetrators of human rights violation, whereas the broader scene, the broader context of human rights violation, the economic and political causes of human rights violation are not really addressed. And that was a right critique a couple of years ago, but I would say we have a little bit overcome this state, and there has been remarkable developments in the last 10 to 15 years in the field of business and human rights, and that goes as well for countries in the global south as for those in the global north. Obviously, the US-based human rights movement was on the forefront. The so-called Alien Tort Claims Act cases in the 80s and in the 90s not only addressed the torturers from Paraguay, but later on also the big oil companies, Unocal, because of their involvement in human rights violation in today's Myanmar, or Shell, because of the pollution and the repression in Nigeria. So that was the first important cases. But later on also actors from all around Europe developed similar litigation, maybe not as successful until now, to address all kinds of environmental crimes, repression against trade unionists, but also unfair working conditions, especially in South Asia. But even more important, and I would say even more innovative, are those efforts of organizations, for example in South Africa or in India, where collective economic and social rights are addressed, such as the right to food case in India, which was successful at the Indian Supreme Court, or the right to water cases in South Africa. And recently I would say there is a certain shift that we work more often together. So it's a kind of globalization from below what is happening, and that is not only the famous summits in Brazil of the anti-globalization movement. No, it's a more daily cooperation, and it's a cooperation which involves lawyers, and that I find particularly interesting. That lawyers from the Philippines, such as our friends from Center Law and ourselves, plus some Swiss organizations, are researching the use of toxic pesticides in the Philippines or in India, and try to develop cases against Europe-based pesticide producers who produce toxic pesticides and don't sell them on the European market because they are too dangerous and therefore prohibited, but outside of Europe. And that is one of those many examples of double standards, which are now being addressed by us, by our networks. Obviously, there is one danger of focusing too much on the legal side of the problem. We all know that most of our cases can only address the tip of the iceberg. It's if we file a case against a German company for their involvement in a Pakistani textile factory fire, we can only address their responsibility or their negligence regarding the work security conditions, the fire security conditions, and we cannot really litigate against the completely unfair working conditions of the whole textile industry in South Asia. So it is a little bit dangerous to also call for public attention for this kind of legal cases, because that might lead to the conclusion of the audience, if the case is decided in a court, the problem is solved, and obviously that is not the case. And therefore we think it's very important to contextualize our legal work and to connect it with the efforts of the affected communities and the social movement. And that is obviously a really tough work, because we have to do a lot of translation between German and English and indigenous languages, but also a translation between the language and the discourse of the lawyers and the thinking and the perspective of non-lawyers. We have to address the power relations in the countries, between normally middle-class lawyers and the normally not middle-class affected communities, and then also the power relations between the working conditions for human rights groups in the Philippines, in India, and those in Europe and North America. So all of what I try to explain in a couple of sentences here is work in progress, but we think it's worth it because it adds a new element to the political and social struggles worldwide. Thank you very much, and I wish you a fruitful discussion, and I hope I could contribute to it a little bit.